G'day Virtual Pilots, Requiem here. We're going to have a look at the next video for the EM series, so I'm assuming you understand the concept we've talked about previously. You can check out those videos if you need a refresher on them. In this video we're going to be comparing the P-51D and the 190 D-9. So we'll look at the EM graphs for them at different altitudes, along with their roll rates, climb rates, acceleration, as well as examining their flaps and the effective ways to use them or not use them. Here's the EM graph for the P-51 at sea level, which you can pause and have a look at if you like. And like before, here are the numbers pulled directly from the graph for the P-51 on this graph. Here's the EM graph for the 190 D9 at sea level, which you can review now. Here's the specific data from that graph pulled to show the important points for the 190. Now looking at the comparison here between the P-51 and the D-9, this is at sea level and the P-51 is using 150 octane fuel. So we can see there's this top speed advantage to the P-51 versus the D-9, and the crossover point is around 270 miles per hour. And above this, there's no real big sustained turn performance difference, and the specific excess power isn't a big factor. However, once you're getting below 270 miles an hour, that's when the P-51 will start to gain more of an advantage in a sustained turn fight, because you can see it has a higher lift limit. This will allow it to fight at a slower airspeed before stalling. But the differences aren't that great. This is why we're going to look at the other parts of airplane performance comparing these two. But a big factor is going to be the G-suit. So because the P-51 pilot is equipped with a G-suit, this means that he's able to pull a higher amount of G compared to the pilot of the D-9. And this has a follow-on effect for the corner airspeed, as you can see here. The corner airspeed for the P-51 is around 280 miles an hour, and this is greater than the D-9's. However, because the pilot of the P-51 has that G-suit, that increases his ability to pull G, and this ends up increasing the turn rate to around 34 degrees a second for the P-51 versus 28 degrees per second at the D-9 when they're both at their corner airspeed. So what this means is that, say if you're in a descending fight or in one with excess energy, the P-51 has a better instantaneous turning ability which it will be able to exploit. So bringing the flight up to 15,000 feet, you can see that the speed advantage that the P-51 has been reduced a little bit, and then once you get above 25,000 feet, the 190 actually takes over and will be faster than the P-51. Because the fight ends up being higher and you have altitude to play with, the sustained turn data isn't going to be as important unless you're both trying to maintain altitude, so this makes the corner airspeed even more critical. These propeller-based airplanes are thrust limited, so when this is the case, that means that they're unable to maintain their corner airspeed and altitude at the same time. So by having this altitude to play with, this means that these airplanes are going to be giving up altitude in order to maintain their corner airspeed on the way down towards the ground. Now in addition to the performance advantage as the fight gets down lower, the P-51 also has a G-suit which gives it another advantage as well. So if it can get in close to the 190, it'll be able to hopefully force the fight to go downhill, where it can use that G advantage to either gain position or simply match the G that the 190 is pulling until they're out of options, and then you can prosecute for the kill. So this means that for the 190, it wants to try and avoid a descending turn fight and hopefully force an overshoot from the P-51. Because as you get lower and lower, this starts giving the P-51 more of a performance advantage. So this means that the 190s should try and work in pairs using high-speed slashing attacks, and they can pull G momentarily to take a shot, but then you should sort of unload and extend away from the fight. And hopefully if a P-51 or another airplane starts chasing you, then your wingman can attack and finish them off. So now you may be wondering just how many Gs you can pull and for how long before you black out. Well, I've done some flight testing and Floppysock has created this chart to show us the data. So this graph shows the 190, which doesn't have a G-suit, and this will also apply to other aircraft without a G-suit as well. And you can see that when it's pulling around 7G, the pilot will black out after about 9 seconds, and if you're pulling less than 3G, there's no time limit, so you won't be able to black out at that point. Now moving on to aircraft which have G suits, such as the P-51, we can see this data should show an improvement, and you can see it can pull a higher amount of G, as in 8 Gs, for about 11 seconds before passing out. And again, pulling less than 3G, that'll be fully sustainable without any blackout issues. So just bear in mind that these numbers are approximate, and it's heavily based on how you fly. So if you're flying an already fatigued pilot, or if you're increasing and decreasing your Gs very rapidly, then these numbers won't match what you're expecting. Now to see this in practice, I have an example using a P-38. Now this does have the G suit, so it still applies just as if it were a P-51. So here we have a 190 D-9 is approaching at 6 o'clock. So immediately roll and start pulling and putting it into a defensive spiral and increasing the amount of G I'm pulling. And what ends up happening is the 190 tries to pull to match, but he'll start getting close to blacking out towards the end of this maneuver, and he can't keep up with me. You can see that he's moving forward on the canopy, so I've gained angles, and now he ends up being spat out in front, which is necessary for him in order to end up not blacking out and crashing into the ground, and that puts him in a defensive position where I can shoot at him and finish him off. So the EM diagrams will provide one part of the story, and roll rates are another important part as well. So when we look at the graph here, the aircraft which has the greater roll rate, which is the 190 in this case, this gives it an important advantage when it's an attacker and as a defender. This is because a higher roll rate will allow you to make faster changes in direction. So this will end up favouring a one-circle fight with multiple turn reversals over a two-circle fight which relies on turn rates specifically. So if you're attacking the P-51 from behind, the 190 can use its roll rate to counter the evasive manoeuvres by the P-51, such as the flat scissors, because it's able to change its direction faster and therefore can fly a longer flight path which will allow it to stay behind the P-51. When it's defensive though, there are two aspects that come into play. The first is going to be jinking. If you're having a high roll rate, the defender can perform a jinking maneuver right before the attacker shoots. This will help take them out of plane relative to their attacker. This will help them avoid being shot. The fact that you have this higher roll rate that allows you to perform this jink is also the same thing that prevents the attacker from being able to compensate fast enough to get a tracking shot against you, so it effectively turns their attempt at a tracking shot into a snapshot. The second advantage that a roll rate gives you in defensive fighting is in a flat scissors, because it allows you to change your directions more often, and you can force the overshoot much easier because your forward airspeed is going to be lower than your opponent, so that means their closure is going to be high against you and they're more likely to overshoot. So if your major advantage is in roll rate, you'll find that you'll work best by flying as a pair using hit and run tactics, implementing things such as a drag and bag or thatch weave technique. This is because of that high roll rate and the quick change of direction that results will allow one fighter to attack while the other distracts the bandit, and then they can swap the roles as needed. While roll rate itself is important, roll acceleration is also very important to consider, because when you're fighting, you're not often going to be rolling more than 180 degrees at a time. So this means you may not ever actually achieve the maximum rate in a dogfight. Now this graph is showing you a comparison between the Mustang and the 190 and how long it takes them to roll 360 degrees, so it's a form of acceleration. Here you can see that at lower airspeeds, the Mustang has a clear disadvantage because the 190 is able to roll much faster, which will give it a good advantage in terms of flat scissors and jinking. But as the airspeeds start getting faster and faster, the gap between the Mustang and the 190 in terms of roll acceleration starts getting smaller, but the advantage still goes to the 190. Here are climb rate comparisons provided by the developers and the technical specifications for both of these airplanes. You can see that at sea level, the climb rates are relatively even, so neither pilot is going to really be able to climb away from the other at lower altitudes. However, once you start getting higher, you can start seeing the advantage going towards the D-9 in terms of climb rate. So this means that the D-9 is going to want to utilize its climb rate up at higher altitudes to stay above the P-51. And on the flip side, if a P-51 finds itself above a D-9 at these higher altitudes, because of the climb rate difference, It means that eventually the D-9 is going to be able to climb up to your altitude, so you're kind of on a limited time frame if you're trying to utilize an energy fight against a D-9 up high. So for the unloaded accelerations, starting altitude was 20,000 feet at 290 miles an hour indicated, and the finishing altitude was 16,000 feet with 400 miles per hour indicated. And these are unloaded dives at 0G, and both airplanes were only able to maintain this for around 16 seconds before they experienced engine cutout due to fuel starvation. So what you should think about is if you're trying to accelerate towards your fastest airspeed, you should consider unloading somewhere between 0 and 1G. This will allow the engine to keep running and for you to accelerate faster for a longer period of time. Bear in mind though that whoever doesn't unload more efficiently when diving, you won't accelerate as good as the other guy, and if you're carrying any excess airspeed above your max, you can't maintain it after you level off. Additionally, because these airplanes are accelerating to an airspeed that's higher than their maximum level flight airspeed, this means that they can't maintain the excess airspeed when they level off. So when they begin leveling off, they're going to be looking to experience the negative effects of compressibility, which are those strong cockpit vibrations, or if they're noticing the engine starting to sputter due to the fuel starvation. And these are their indicators which are going to tell them to begin leveling off. And in this case, that started happening around 400 miles per hour after about 16 seconds. Now, because the P-51 has a higher maximum airspeed at these lower altitudes, it's still going to decelerate just like the 190 will, but it's going to decelerate to a faster overall airspeed, which will allow it to escape from the 190. So unless you're really close to a Mustang and a 190, it's not really worth it chasing them if they begin that unloaded dive, and you're much better off maintaining your altitude. Now we can take this concept of unloading and apply it to increase our roll rate as well. So instead of just pitching over and accelerating in a dive, you could unload and roll at the same time, and this is actually going to increase your roll rate compared to if you just try to roll while either applying G or staying level. Remember that rolling is not just about using your ailerons, but you can also use your rudder to help your roll rate improve as well. Alright, so here's some data for level acceleration between the Mustang and the D-9. We see they're both starting at 120 miles an hour, and they both finish around 300 miles an hour for the purpose of the test. And between the different speed ranges, you can see that at the lower airspeeds, the D-9 has a decent advantage in level acceleration. But once you get up in the higher airspeeds, about 250 miles an hour and above, it's kind of negligible at that point. So when you look at the total average acceleration, you can see the D-9 is faster. And note that the total time for it to reach that airspeed of 300 miles an hour is actually 20 seconds faster than the P-51. So generally speaking, if you can't get a lot of separation initially to escape as a P-51, then you really shouldn't attempt it, because if you're both at that slower airspeed, then the P-51 is going to be run down by the D-9. So this makes it very important for the Mustang pilot, if they choose to disengage, to create as much separation as possible, because it's likely that the D-9 is going to be out accelerating them initially and catching up to them, so you need to have that extra time in your pocket until you can reach your faster airspeeds to actually have a speed advantage to escape. Now I don't want to get into a big discussion about flaps and all the different kinds of flaps and whatnot, but essentially flaps will help to increase your lift. This is going to increase your lift limit, so this means you're going to have a lower stall speed, but at the same time, the kind of trade-off you get with this is that you're going to create more drag, and this is what we're also going to look at on the energy management diagram here. In these pictures, I'm just showing you that when the airplane is clean, it's going to have a higher angle of attack to the relative wind for a given airspeed. And then if we go to the next one, we can see that the airplane is flying at the same airspeed, but with the flaps set to 30 degrees, it's going to have a lower angle of attack because it's compensated by the lift produced with the flaps. However, because of the increased drag, this is going to require a higher power setting with the flaps out to maintain that 225 miles an hour. So here's the turn performance data for the Mustang at sea level, which you've seen before. And now we're going to take the test data, showing up to flaps 30. Now what you can see here with these three lines is they're obviously at different airspeeds because you have different flap restrictions, but it also creates these different curves. And these curves are the sustained turn data where the specific excess power is equal to 0. So we're essentially plotting 4 different versions of where the specific excess power will equal 0, where we have a clean configuration, flaps 10, flaps 20, and flaps 30. You can see that as we start extending the flaps out towards 30, that region is going to get larger and larger, because with each successive flap setting, we're going to be creating more drag for the airplane to try and overcome in order to sustain a turn. So what this means for you is that if you're trying to sustain a turn, you don't want to be using flaps necessarily in a dogfight, but you can exploit the properties of what they're doing to your airplane performance to your advantage if you need to. So remember that the first point we made was that with the flaps, they can lower your stall speed. So what this allows you to do is to be more stable at a low speed. So if you're flying in a 1-circle fight, that can be advantageous to put the flaps out, and that way you're able to fly at a slower speed, fly at a tighter radius, and force an overshoot. However, if you're in a situation where you're trying to be in a 2-circle fight, then you don't want to use flaps, because it's going to increase your energy burn, and it's going to prevent you getting up towards your peak corner speed, or maintaining your best sustained turn speed without suffering undue energy loss. The other aspect of flaps we can use to our advantage is the drag that they produce. So let's say you're in a descending spiral, you'd want to be using your flaps coming downhill, because this way you're going to increase the drag. This is going to slow down how fast your airplane's accelerating, and if your opponent isn't doing that, then that's going to force him to accelerate faster, and he'll overshoot faster. The other situation where we can use this drag for our advantage is from an offensive position where you've attacked a bandit and you've got too much airspeed coming down, and you're going to end up overshooting and put yourself in a bad position. So an option is to put the flaps out, and this way it'll increase the drag, and that helps slow you down fast enough to hopefully prevent the overshoot and allow you to stay behind the bandit and continue attacking. So to finish off, we can look at the overall number comparison between the P-51 and the 190. So the style for the D-9 against the Mustang, it's going to want to act to conserve its energy and try and remain up at the higher altitudes, as that's where it starts getting an airspeed advantage. The corner airspeed for it is slower than the Mustang, and it doesn't have a G-suit either, so that means it's going to have a lower turning performance, and that means at a merge, you're going to want to take away the P-51's turning room. You also want to avoid descending turn fights, because the P-51's advantages become more apparent the lower you get against you. Your best advantages in the D9 are going to be found in your roll rate and your acceleration in roll. This will allow you to try and force overshoots if you have a Mustang behind you by utilizing flat scissors. You can also utilize it to jink and avoid shots at the last moment to prevent the Mustang getting a good hit on you. And the extra roll rate will also allow you to use hit and run tactics with a wingman. So after you make an attack, you can use that quick roll rate to change directions, and then as your target chases you, your wingman can come in and make a pass against him. So for the energy style of the Mustang against the D9, you have the option to exploit or conserve your energy. This is because you have an overall performance advantage thanks to the G-suit. This allows you to have a higher corner airspeed because you're able to pull a higher maximum G. This will provide you a superior instantaneous turn rate and a smaller turn radius. So you'll find the bigger advantage is found when you're exploiting your energy, but if you find yourself with too much energy, you can utilize the flaps in the Mustang, as this can be beneficial to prevent or force overshoots in certain situations by helping you bleed off the excess energy, as we talked about earlier. The roll performance in the Mustang is going to be lower compared to the D9 at low speeds, and at high speeds the gap narrows a little bit, but the advantage still goes to the 190. This means you need to be cautious if you're behind a 190 to prevent being forced into an overshoot, because it has that superior roll rate, and you also need to be aware that when you are lining a shot, the 190 has a good ability to jink, so it may be able to go defensive and jink to avoid your shots relatively easily. Well, that's the end of this energy maneuverability video between the P-51D and the 190 D-9. Hope you enjoyed it and were able to take away a few different things from this. I know there was a lot to it, and I included some extra concepts in as well that'll help you apply it to other airplanes. If you did happen to enjoy it, you can use the like button or leave a comment as feedback if you like. And don't forget to become a subscriber, and as always, fly safe and check your six.